As we know, Telecom Act of 1996 provided for interconnection requirement in, I believe it was Section 251. Obligations of carriers to provide for interconnection, and the purpose was to foster competition in the last mile and to enable business and consumer choice among providers. So the question is, as we have these transitions that we now see going on in rapid fashion, should there be change to interconnection, and what change would and should that be? I will provide some context, and that is we have two sorts of transition going on. One is from copper to fiber, and the other, of course, as we've talked about, is TDM to IP. And I think we need to be clear in those distinctions as we discuss this, because it's easy to confuse those. So first question is, and this is kind of getting to the crux of the matter, to what extent should PSTN interconnection requirements apply to IP networks? I'll start with Bob Quinn, AT&T, and then we'll interplay to the CLECs, and then we'll go to Verizon and NXO thereafter.
Okay. Thanks for having me here. But I would tell you that we're at the very early stages of the IP transition, particularly as it relates to IP to IP interconnection to replace the existing 251 interconnection processes. I think the FCC does have a role here. I didn't raise my hand there, but they have a role, and part of the role that they have is we've got to figure the routing out in the IP to IP world so that we don't, as Dan pointed out, have to traverse all this VoIP traffic back to the PSTN in order to be able to communicate it. We have some IP to IP deals that we see in the marketplace today. Very difficult to scale that because we've got to replace the LERC. So there's these large databases that kind of control traffic flows that we have to come up with IP equivalents for. So we're very early in the process of how we're going to replace 251 voice interconnection trunks with IP interconnection. But I'm going to make some observations. 251 interconnection, I think it was pointed out on one of the early panels, was created in a world where we had local calls and long distance calls, intra-LATA calls and intra-LATA calls. We had intra-LATA long distance calls. And depending on the regulatory characterization of the call, it was important because it judged how much one carrier had to pay another carrier in order to terminate the traffic. Therefore, we had rules at the FCC that required us to have an interconnection with other carriers in every particular LATA if they chose to have that interconnection in each LATA. LATAs are largely irrelevant to the entire world now, let alone the IP world where they were never relevant. We had state commissions determining what the rates for carrier interconnection was going to be for the purpose of transmission and termination of local calls. I don't know necessarily exactly what IP replacement for 251 is going to look like, but it's not going to look like that. It's not going to be an interconnection in every single LATA. LATAs, they're just meaningless to the world of the internet. I think there are going to be significantly fewer interconnection points. I don't see the state commissions having a role here at all in determining what they're going to be, because not every state's going to necessarily have an interconnection point. I think IP to IP interconnection is going to look a lot more like the interconnections that we have that connect the internet across the entire world, where there's no regulatory body overseeing any individual piece of that puzzle. But I also believe we're at the very, very early stages of it. And I think my sense is we were able to connect the internet without having an oversight regulatory authority and any individual company overseeing this. We ought to let that play out and see what it looks like as we go through the process of replacing those 251 interconnections which exist today and replacing them with IP to IP interconnection. Christy?
I don't disagree with you. in terms of that the interconnection agreement itself will be completely different, right, than a TDM interconnection agreement, different, points of interconnection and so forth. So I think the agreement will be different. What we are advocating for is that there continue to be a 251 regulatory backstop. So we're not advocating for the FCC to hop in and determine the puts and takes of a particular interconnection agreement, but what we are looking for is a regulatory backstop that requires incumbents to negotiate IP interconnection agreements and have reasonable terms and conditions, and the ability to go to a regulatory body, be that a state commission where the jurisdiction lies with the state, or to the federal government should those negotiations fail. So, and then just one more point with respect to the internet. I agree that the structure of the agreement is going to be different, but nobody thinks this is the internet. It's not the same. It's not the same structure, right? I mean, it's a different structure when you're doing voice over IP versus a best efforts internet solution.
Well, Paula, is Skype the internet? That's voice with 250 million connections.
Right, but when you're sending voice over IP, you've really got to be able to manage it. You've got to have quality of service, and it's a completely different set of technological requirements when you're sending voice traffic over a managed network as opposed to a best efforts internet solution.
Oh, David, go ahead.
Sure. So Christy referred to the need to have a backstop to interconnect with the incumbents. I think it's worth unpacking that a little bit and going back to some of the discussion earlier, because today the incumbent has maybe 10 to 30% of the market in terms of circuit switched voice connections to the home. In most areas, there are significantly more wireless connections. There are typically an equivalent number of cable VoIP connections. And so the universe that those rules were created for just doesn't exist anymore. And so I think, as Bob said, whatever it looks like, it's going to look different than the old world. And whatever that new world is going to look like needs to recognize the fact that it's an environment that's not dominated by one monopoly service provider, but it's actually a number of fairly equivalently sized in terms of overall market shares. I think it's also useful to look at the internet as an example, not from yes, voice is different, the technology is different, the requirements of the interconnections are going to be different, how the interconnections actually works will be different, and the agreements themselves, will be different than the old voice agreements to some extent. But I think it's useful to look at the internet marketplace, interconnection marketplace, where basically it's a commercial structure where anybody can go and if you want to be in the internet business, if you want to be an ISP, you go, you buy transit from somebody, and there's a commercial market for transit, and you are now an ISP, and you provide internet service to your customers, and that provides them with connectivity to the global internet. I think what we need to do is move in the voice market to a similar, more commercial-based approach that provides competitive options that people can purchase if they want connectivity to, let's say, the global PSTN, but that carriers would also be able to negotiate any other types of interconnection arrangements among themselves as well.
It's not limited to carriers, right?
Well, voice providers of any sort,
yeah,
and maybe beyond just voice. So we're talking about voice because it's still narrowband voice today, but as Bob said, Skype is video and video conferencing, FaceTime. I think real-time video communications will be a primary means of communication in the not-too-distant future. What are the interconnection rules for that going to be? And clearly the dominant players there are not Bob's company or my company. They're Microsoft and Apple.
Thank you, David. Lisa?
I will just start by saying and echoing what Christy said. So we are on record as saying, where we can have commercial agreements, that's what we all want to do that, of course, and accomplish that, but we do need the regulatory backstop. We agree the interconnection agreements might look different. I think we all said that. But we do think we need the regulatory backstop for the reasons Christy cited, but then I will add, because, and this is a discussion we're not having, and maybe not having today, and that's fine, we've all had it in other places many times, because the market power and the leverage are still in favor of the incumbents. And I know David cited several statistics, but you were talking about wireless and really residential. You're really talking about residential statistics. Cut the cord is more of a residential issue. Again, not an issue here for today, perhaps. But anyway, so the market power and leverage discussions are still what are driving the need for that regulatory backstop. And then the only thing I would add, because we really did cover everything here already, as far as sort of comparing the ability to change our IP interconnection world to something more similar to peering, they are different animals, as Christy said. They're absolutely different animals. Best efforts versus managed voice, managed VoIP, and even Verizon and AT&T, their voice services, they acknowledge don't touch the public internet. We know this. We've seen this. These are quoted from their website itself. So we know they're different animals, and they're different animals for them too in the voice world. So that's why we still think we need the regulatory backstop, and that the we still need, whether it's federal or state, we still think there's a state role under 251, and we think that's something we'll need for IP interconnection. But if we can have commercial agreements in place, great, let's do it. But if we can't, we need that regulatory backstop.
The state question,
Sure.
and that's a good one. So your point is that there is, and perhaps there should be a place for interconnection. Based on the history of things and going forward, should we accommodate that in some way based on the evidence of industry movement? Bob, the wire center idea and the trial that you're doing there, and that you proposed as a means of determining what the future of an interconnection could look like, or determining what an all IP network could look like without interconnection. Explain to us what the purpose is of the trial and what question you hope can be answered by it.
So to be clear, I actually don't think that interconnection is really implicated by the trial that we proposed, because the trial we proposed is really at the wire center and it's at the retail level. Most of the 251 interconnections that we have actually occur out at tandem offices which really are not impacted. It's not to say that in the IP transition that we don't need to focus on this issue and deal with it. I'm just suggesting that for purposes of what we were asking the FCC to do, it's not going to necessarily impact those relationships at all. What we were trying to get at with the trial offer to the FCC is really to kind of look at this from more of a consumer perspective, because the wire center level is where we offer the retail services to consumers. There's a whole bunch of different issues that are going to be implicated, whether it's a part of the footprint that isn't going from copper to fiber, it's going from copper to wireless. Parts of our footprint that we would like to retire the TDM, but we'll have a wireline IP solution in its place. And it was really to kind of tackle the consumer social issues that I think we perceive that we're going to have to get through in order to do this. And what we were proposing is to have the FCC oversee that process. We don't know what we don't know. We don't know what's going to break when we turn off TDM. And what we're hoping for, still hoping for, I guess, is that the FCC would initiate a proceeding to allow us to kind of come in with a plan as to how we would take all of those retail services that are represented by USOCs today and map what the replacement IP product, or in the circumstances where the economics don't make sense to do a broadband wireline solution, what the wireless solution is going to be for that part of the footprint, and to give a forum basically for everybody to kind of raise their issues so that we can settle the issues that, we're not going to pretend to understand what every argument's going to be. We don't know what services we're going to, are going to break when we do it. We know from doing some of the wireless work that we've done that fax services aren't supported. We'll make a decision as to whether or not that's something that we can't fix with a better type of service in an IP environment. But it was really to do it in kind of a comprehensive way so that everybody could have the ability to participate in the proceeding, raise their issues, and find a way to get resolution on those issues. Because at the end of the day, we've got like 4,000 wire centers that we've got to convert. We need to get started with that. So we thought by us putting a couple of wire centers out there, we could get a map as to what it's going to take to be able to take the learnings from those 2 wire centers and have an approach that we can scale to be able to do 4,000 wire centers. And our trial wasn't limited to us. I thought that any ILEC should be able to participate in that trial that wants to participate in the trial and get the same kind of learnings. And that way you'll have the diverse geographies and diverse communities that are going to be impacted by this. And the FCC can really control the experiment rather than to have to do what Verizon's doing at Fire Island, which is caused by a storm, and they're kind of having to do this transition all at once, with kind of no net underneath them. I think if you can avoid doing it that way, I think it's better. And if we don't start this for 10 years, we're going to be doing what's happening on Fire Island today by necessity. We're going to be doing that everywhere because the necessity is still out there, as was discussed on one of the prior panels.
Thank you. Christy, as you look at the trial that's being proposed, what things would you like to see considered with it, and how do you think the FCC ought to take on those considerations? And of course, I think we'll have a keynote here shortly from the FCC, and perhaps their view of the test can be, or the trial can be discussed then. But what are your thoughts on the initiation of the trial?
Well, we are not opposed to trials. We think that under certain circumstances they can be useful. I hear what Bob is saying about the need to test and ensure that that you don't flip a switch and it breaks. And so we certainly understand that. But what we have filed at the FCC is a set of comments to propose some parameters around what the trials will be. The concern is that we don't want to divert any scarce FCC resources to just open-ended trials. We want to make sure that the information that they're seeking, that the FCC would be seeking to find, is material, that it's needed, with respect to their duties under the scope of the Act, and that they would be gathered on a timely basis. So certainly not opposed to trials, but would like to see a very strict set of parameters about how the trials are conducted, and what information that would set forth at the initiation of the trial, the information that they're trying to collect.
David?
So I think the concept of the trials is a good one, but I think it's worthwhile thinking about really what's happening with this transition. These new networks are here. These aren't something that we're thinking about doing. I mean, they're here. Consumers are making the transition. 40% have cut the cord and gone to wireless for their voice. We heard 40 million have gone to voice over IP. So the transition is well underway. Consumers are doing this today. And I think that there's a lot that can be learned just by looking at what's happening in the marketplace already. I think really, though, what needs to be tested and what the trials would be about are turning off the old PSTN is really what it comes down to, because as I said, the transition's already happening. We are trying to help customers make that transition by moving them to our new networks and new platforms in a way that's driven by their needs and wants and desires. We've unfortunately been forced by circumstances in Fire Island to speed things up a little bit with a service that we were developing to offer optionally to consumers that became the primary way of providing voice service on Fire Island, and that's VoiceLink. And on the previous panel, you heard about that as well. And basically what that is something that a Verizon technician would come, install in the customer's house, connect to their internal wiring, and that would ring all the phones, provide dial tone, and basically provide normal phone service as the customer's always known it. When they call 911, it provides the address that they live in, so it's 16 Main Street, Unit 5B. That's what's going to show up at the PSAP. And but it's not provided by the wireline copper network anymore. It's provided by a wireless device that's installed in the customer's home where it gets a good signal. It's fixed to the wall so that signal doesn't vary over time. So it's not like when you're driving down the street and a call drops because you suddenly lose connectivity. And it provides 36 hours of battery backup time with a rechargeable battery that's built into it today. We're working on a model actually that would have AA batteries that the consumer could replace as well. So you could go to Home Depot or to Costco and buy a 36 pack of these things and keep your phone going for 2 weeks if you had an extended power outage. So this is a solution that fortunately we had in the works and we were able to roll out very quickly so that Fire Island could open for business this summer, and they are now open for business and operating because if we had to replace the wireline network, it would have been years.
Lisa, thoughts on the nature of the trial? And
Sure. I'm going to start by agreeing with David on a couple points. I know,
Write
surprise.
this down.
The IP transition is here. We should have said that from the outset. I know the competitors and maybe all the carriers have been doing this for a long time. I know specifically for us for a decade. So it is here and it is in front of us. And I agree with David also that there's a lot of information already out there. We should be gathering that, collecting that, looking at that, and that's part of the FCC's public notice. That is part of their plan, and I think there's a lot to learn from that, and I don't think we should get trials in front of knowing what that is, knowing it's already out there. As far as the trials themselves, I actually want to go back to the FCC's public notice. Your question sort of presumed that the FCC's starting point is the AT&T proposal, when in fact, how I read the public notice, it is not. The public notice is much broader than that. It asks about technology transition trials in general, disability access, wireless to wireline, next-gen 911. And then one of the bullet points is, and the AT&T proposal. Anyway, so the what's before the FCC as a whole is really much broader. And I don't think the starting point.
Also within the context of TDM to IP transition?
Yes, I'm sorry, there were many things in their list, right?
Okay.
My point is it's much broader. It's not just as proposed by one party, and that's right. Important. As far as, so in our position on trials, we a little different from Christy, maybe, actually not entirely, but we're not certain that trials are needed. We don't like how they're proposed now by AT&T. We're worried about the disruption caused by their original proposal. I understand I'm hearing some other things, so that might be fine. From the first panel today, I think one of the gentlemen shared, here are some issues I've identified with the problem transitioning from TDM to IP. I would rather we identified what are those exact issues. I don't think there's that level of specificity yet. And then you have testing around that. And we are in the middle of a comment cycle. We have comments due July 8th, and we're going to see a lot of that come in, and then we're all going to have a chance to react to that. But I think sort of more specificity in what we're exactly testing, I think that would be better for all of us, and I know for my company specifically, we can sort of react better to that.
So let's move on to tackle the state issue. We have obligations of carriers of last resort, and I believe the states are the ones that step in and help that be adjudicated regionally. What is the role of the states in governing interconnection relative to timing and pace, or just relative to whether they should continue to adjudicate that? I'm sure we have varying opinions on that. What is the future outcome that you think would be best with regard to state governance or not?
Well, from our perspective, I think this goes back to the 251 issue, right? I mean, the states were delegated with the authority to arbitrate interconnection agreements when needed. We don't know that it will be needed, but we certainly are not ready to let go of that regulatory backstop. With respect to their role, I mean, they really are the role of interconnection. I think at the outset, with the Act, certainly the FCC recognized, or Congress recognized, that you can't have everybody up at the FCC arbitrating. And while there may be fewer IP interconnections based on fewer points of interconnection throughout your network, I still think that the state, or our company still thinks that the state would be the proper role in arbitrating that interconnection agreement. And at that point, too, it should be recognized that you will have the technical details. You know, you'll have a list of things. You have to bring a list, a very detailed list to the commission to look at. So it would be a much more detailed discussion if it rose to that level at a state commission. But we think the role of the state in the IP transition is important, period. And with the respect to interconnection, it's vital.
So a regulatory backstop established at the Fed, if you will, with regard to Telecom Act or something of that variety, but with the state required to enforce it with their
Well, it's the same as, I
expectations.
mean, we don't really view it as any different. I mean, interconnection is a vital part of competition. And, you know, this entire transition has been, at least from our perspective, primarily driven by competition. And so you can't have competition without interconnection, you know, or last mile access for that matter. So, you know, the bottom line for us is that, you know, in this IP transition, the most important thing to focus on is the fact that you've got to preserve competition. Competition is what drove it, so you don't want to kill it. You know, it's an anathema. You've got to protect competition first, and interconnection is a vital part of that. So not really advocating for a change, not coming up with a whole new set of rules or new laws, just keep what we have. We think that the Act is technology neutral, and we think that the FCC should mandate that interconnection requirements apply to IP.
Bob?
Well, you know, I'm going to go back to the fact that both of these companies provide internet services, and they have to either have transiting or peering relationships that they were able to establish with broadband companies so that their customers of their broadband services can go anywhere they want on the internet, and there's no regulatory body overseeing any of that. So, you know, I go back to those connections already exist today. And so the fact that you're going to argue that we need regulation for voice because it's somehow different than broadband, I don't see it. I'm a believer that what we should do is we should have regulation where there's a demonstration of market failure. And we're so early in the IP to IP interconnection process that I think the jury's out as to what it's going to look like and where it's going to go. In terms of the state role, I think we're kind of a crossroads, and I think that the crossroads we're at is that historically, when regulation first began in this country, whether it was the Communications Act of 1934 or state regulation of voice services, the network was the service, and it was all the same thing. And what's going on at the state level is the realization that as we separate the actual application of voice from the network infrastructure, there's a real struggle as to what the state role is. I think the state role should be focused on consumer protection, but I don't know that Skype would argue or accept the fact that somehow every state in the United States and every state in every country across the world is suddenly going to have a regulatory role over the provision of Skype services. And I think that there's kind of a vacuum, and since the Vonage decision came out, I think there's been kind of a vacuum to try and figure out what the state role is as we move into a place where the services that have traditionally been regulated, which was a voice wireline monopoly service, becomes an application that rides atop of a broadband infrastructure. And that's the struggle. So, you know, Vonage doesn't need an interconnection agreement with me in order to get their voice traffic handled. And Skype doesn't have an interconnection agreement with me. It's not to say that when we get into the world that Dan wants to get to with HD voice, that some management is going to be required to make sure we maintain quality of service, and the door is going to be open to those. But those companies don't have available to them today the right to get a 251 interconnection. And all of this is caused by the fact that we've moved the traditionally regulated services to a different layer than just the physical interconnection. And I think that's going to be a challenge, is to try and figure out how to deal with that and what the state role in this new world is going to be. But it should be focused on making sure the consumers are protected.
So I'll go to Lisa now, because I'm thinking that to some extent Bob outlined the problem that you're asking to be defined associated with that transition. Did he answer that for you there, or is there more to be said?
No, my reaction to that is, and I'll go back and reiterate what Christy said as our position and then respond a little bit to that. And we said this before, we do think there needs to be regulatory backstop for all of the reasons Christy said. We're talking about the TDM to IP transition, which is a change of electronics. We think the Act is technology neutral. People are talking about, you know, our first panel talked about here's what's happening with the IP transition. Here are the things that are happening. I didn't hear anything, those were technical things. I didn't hear anything in there that required a change in the regulatory structure we're all living under. So for Christie's point, when she said nothing's changed, that's correct. That's how we see it. The Act is technology neutral. 251 still covers this. There's nothing really changed here. And back to a point we all just made a minute ago, the IP transition has been happening. We're not talking about anything that just went boom and we all have to adjust to it quickly. I think we answered this already, so sorry for the repetition, but in terms of, there's a difference between IP peering and managed voice. And so relating this to IP peering is, it's a non-starter because IP peering involves a world of best efforts. That's true of the Skype service. And managed voice is different, and they're different for a number of technical reasons that, maybe we don't have to go into here. But so for us, the IP peering example isn't relevant. It's still under the 251 rubric.
So I think that, it's worth pointing out that the IP transition is occurring. We have a lot of IP traffic that's being exchanged today through these regulated circuit switched interfaces. And that's not going away. And that actually does a really good job for narrowband voice. So there's no crisis here. We've got something that's in place, that's working, that's able to handle the traffic load. The reason, though, that you had the states as the backstop is because, as Bob said before, the service was local telephone service, and it required interconnection in every state that you wanted to serve. That's not the case today. So now, instead of having to go and negotiate with, how many states do you have, Bob? 20?
22.
22. So instead of having to have interconnection agreements in 22 states, all you have to do is go to Bob's company and say, hey, we want to negotiate an interconnection agreement. It's one agreement. You sit down, you figure out where you're going to interconnect, how you're going to do it, and work it out. So it's a very different environment than the old circuit switched world. And I think we have some breathing room here to figure out how to do it right. We've got the circuit switched interconnections still in place that are getting the job done for today, but they're not going to get the job done for HD voice. They're not going to get the job done for video. And so let's figure out a new model of interconnection that's going to work in that space.
And we're supportive of that. We don't disagree that we need a new model. But where do you go when negotiations fail? What happens? And I think we view this as more of a less urban versus rural. It's more of a large versus small situation. Carriers of like size have an incentive to interconnect with one another. Where you run into a problem is when you have a big guy trying to negotiate with a small guy. The small guy doesn't have a lot of power. And so the concern here is we're not saying at the outset it's going to fail. We're not saying that. We're just saying if it does, where do we go?
Yeah, but
the answer can't be, well, you just don't get to interconnect with us.
Yeah, but the beauty of the internet is you don't need necessarily to interconnect
It's not the internet.
with
It's
me,
not going over
right?
the internet.
I understand that, but if it evolves the way that peering evolved, you don't have to interconnect with me in order for your customers to be able to get to my customers because we've got peering arrangements and there's 15 other companies that you can negotiate with.
So I have to go to level 3 to get my traffic across your network.
But you could go to level 3 to get your traffic to anywhere you wanted
Right.
to. And that's the beauty of kind of ending this terminating monopoly that was caused by the regulatory environment that we had, that the only way in the old world to get your calls terminated to my customers was to have a deal with me. That's not how it exists in the internet. And my guess is when we replace these 251 interconnections with IP interconnections, it's going to look a lot more like the world of peering.
Christy, I'll give you the last word on that before we move to questions.
Well, I guess the problem, let me just go back to the level 3. Our concern here is that we have a set of products. We're talking about managed voice. It goes over a managed network. It's not best efforts. What we would like to be able to, I don't want to be watered down going, I've got to get from here to here to here to here to get to your end use customer. And to my customer to call your customer, I have to go through 14 different interconnection channels to do that. I want to be able to directly interconnect with you the same way that I do today. And that helps me with my products. It helps me manage the quality of service of my products across my network. So I think what I heard you saying was you're going to have options of big guys that we do want to interconnect with, and if you don't want to interconnect with us, then you can go to them. And
Options.
And that can't be the only option. We may choose to do that, but I want to be able to come to AT&T and Verizon and negotiate an interconnection agreement for IP. on reasonable terms and conditions. And to the extent that we don't agree, I want to be able to go somewhere to talk about it.
It's good to see heads nodding around the table to some degree here. This is obviously very sensitive items. I think our panel has done an excellent job of communicating constructively and helpfully, and helpful actually to each other in making your points. And hopefully it's been a good learning session for all of us. Do we have a minute or two for questions? Yes, sir.
The discussion seems to be revolving around managed voice. Can't we substitute in quality of service for managed voice and broaden the discussion a little bit to throw the feet to the fire? I think to the first point, who cares if you can connect to AT&T or anybody else if you can guarantee quality of service regardless of where it goes, would be my first question.
To whom?
You know, to anybody on the panel. Okay. Who cares if you can connect to AT&T if, emphasis on if, you can guarantee quality of service? Okay, that's the first point. Second point is that don't we already have certain quality of service type of arrangements going on in the video field, on the high-end video conferencing? You know, if these arrangements are already occurring for high-end video conferencing, why can't some of these arrangements be broadened to cover the larger field of managed voice and the larger
Okay.
quality of service on a larger retail scale?
Very well. Anybody want to take that?
I think it's a great question, and I think they can be. And I think that is how it is happening and how it will happen. That you know, when two companies decide they want to exchange traffic and IP, as I said, they'll figure out where they're going to do it and how they're going to do it and how to provision it in a way that ensures that there is adequate quality of service. Today in the high-end video space, it happens by having very high capacity interconnections between the companies. I think you'll see similar things to ensure that the voice quality is sustained end to end as well.
But I think your question and some of this discussion ignores the difference in market power and leverage, and those are the issues the FCC still has to tackle.
Just try to keep it to one. I'd like to let's give
fine.
somebody else an
But,
opportunity.
If the call goes through and there's no quality of service, why should you care if you're directly connected to AT&T instead of connected to Verizon? There's still a market, it's a smaller market, and you still have competition.
In 2010, we issued a proposal, I think we're the first carrier to do so, in the intercarrier comp docket linking IP transition and IP to the intercarrier comp docket and asked the FCC to consider those incentives in its intercarrier comp docket. The point being, we wanted to go to IP and have people exchange traffic and IP for efficiency reasons. I want efficiency. And if you're causing more hops for me and more things I have to manage and quality of service, why do I have to do that? I want efficiencies in my network.
But you're gonna, if you have a QoS with SLAs in them, you're gonna get the quality that you negotiated for, irrespective of how your provider provides that QoS. Your only concern should be on the quality, and if you have an agreement that provides you penalties for not delivering the quality that you've negotiated for, that's how the world works.
Next question.
I'd like to go back to the comment that was made about the terminating monopoly. Could someone explain to me how it is the terminating monopoly goes away just because we've moved to IP networks? If I'm the end user customer and I want people to be able to call me, they have to go through the provider that is offering me my service. So how is it the terminating monopoly has ended?
So the terminating monopoly, yes, they have to go through that provider, but the problem in the terminating monopoly came from the regulation that empowered the service provider who was giving you that service to charge the people who were sending calls to you. So access charges, international settlement charges, the wireless.
How is that on? Because you'll still have the capability to do that. I mean, this gets into the level 3 Comcast dispute that was happening.
You're not empowered by the regulator and by law to force somebody to pay those. And so basically, as Bob was saying, there are other ways of getting the traffic there that can, basically, yes, the provider may want to charge you something for a direct interconnection, but if there are other ways that you can get to them, you can avoid paying them that.
But how is it going to get to me if I'm a Verizon customer and Verizon is saying to TW Telecom, you have to pay this certain amount if you want to reach this Verizon customer? I don't think you've answered that.
Yeah, but you can go to, I mean, you can go to any of their peering partners any of the people that they do business with who have settlement-free peering arrangements with them. If you don't have the
But that
size
gets-
or
but-
the scale,
but
can I
Bob-
finish, G&G? Please, all right? If you don't have the size or the scale, you go to one of the peering partners. All these carriers list all of their peering criteria out there, and we have all kinds of settlement-free peering arrangements out there, and you can go to any one of those companies and hand your traffic to them in order to get it terminated in the internet world on our network without coming down having to pay our charge.
But that's where there's the disconnect, I think, where you're thinking there are peering arrangements. I think Christy.
Yeah, I just to say, again, it's not the same. I'm not trying to send my voice traffic to your internet via a peer, via a peering partner. I'm trying to interconnect with you in the same manner that I do today to send the same type of traffic, granted in a different electronic format to you, to terminate to the same end user. I don't want to send it over the internet. That's
No,
not going to work for me.
I understand that, and what we were talking about earlier is you're talking about letting the IP interconnection world evolve, and I think it's going to look a lot more like the internet world, just like we do with high quality video today. You're going to see peering type arrangements that exist. They're going to have QoS capabilities attached to them, and you're going to be able, if you don't like what I charge, you can go somewhere else and get a better rate in order to communicate that traffic. And in that manner, I can't block it from coming to me. I can't say to you, if you don't pay me, then I'm not going to take your traffic. And that's why I'm saying we should let this evolve and see what develops and see what problems we really have to solve before we assume that 251 should be the model for internet voice, for IP interconnection in an internet world, in an IP world.
We know we have 251 today, and how do we move on? It's an interesting question.
Assuming
Assuming we
Yeah.
need to move on. Yeah, I'm not saying move away or, keep or destroy. It's just what's the best. And that's what's being debated here. Wonderful debate. I'll take time for one more question.
Just one more thing on the peering issue. With UVerse, your UVerse customers, is it not, there is nobody that can directly exchange traffic with you to reach their UVerse through a peering arrangement. Isn't that correct?
Well, so today, all interconnections go basically through the POTS PSTN network. I mean, that's basically how it works today, because that's what happens. Because it doesn't matter how many VoIP calls are out there. In order to connect a VoIP call to another company's VoIP call, it all really has to be routed through the POTS infrastructure in order to do the exchange. So today, all of those UVerse calls essentially have to go through the POTS infrastructure, which means they're coming to us generally in 251 interconnection trunks. That's what we're trying to change, is to allow somebody to have an IP-to-IP interconnection that's going to allow us to not have to convert that traffic back to POTS in order to terminate it.
And
that's
we
what-
support that.
You would have your UVerse customers receive their phone calls over an internet access type service, is what you would, that's the future that AT&T
Can you
wants?
speak up, please?
So you would want your UVerse customers to have their traffic, their voice calls go over internet access product? You're no longer going to have a managed VoIP service?
No, I anticipate that it's going to be managed in the future. I anticipate that what will happen in IP-to-IP interconnection is it will evolve, and we're going to have to get to, in order to enable HD voice, we're going to have to enable the ability for VoIP companies to be able to manage this traffic and provide a higher quality voice product that, by the way, is available on POTS today through IP communications. That's what these arrangements, I think, are going to enable, and we're going to have QoS associated with them. I believe that. We have it today that's, for the telepresence, for Cisco telepresence, those arrangements exist for high quality video. we're going to have the same kind of arrangements in the future.
Yeah, and this gets back to what I was saying before about the circuit switch network being in place and providing a backstop for us today. When we're sending long distance calls to AT&T, we go through those circuit switch connections, the interconnection agreements that we've negotiated in the States to reach those UVerse customers. But what I'd like to have is the ability to negotiate. Hey, Bob, my FiOS customers should be able to talk to your UVerse customers over an IP end-to-end connection. Let's negotiate something. I'm not going to do it in 22 states. It's going to be one agreement between Verizon and AT&T, and we'll figure out where it makes sense to interconnect those calls.
Well,
Go ahead, Christy.
I just want to make, before we end, I just want to make clear, we're not sitting up here opposing the IP transition. I mean, we think that competition drove the IP transition, and so we support updating the competition rules so that in the transition you don't kill competition, the very thing that drove it in the first place. So we're ready for IP interconnection. We're ready to negotiate. And all we're saying here is that in the future, if we fail or if there is a market failure with respect to IP interconnection negotiations, we'd like to have somewhere to go to talk about it and not have the solution be, go talk to him.
And right now, the backstop is those TDM interconnections that already exist. I don't have a direct IP interconnection agreement with Bob today, and so I'm able to send those calls through the circuit switch network, through the regulated interconnections in each of those 22 states, and that's my alternative that's available today.
Except that you're then relegating me to, just because I won't agree to an IP interconnection agreement with you at your terms, and I don't have a regulatory backstop for that agreement, I'm there then relegated to the TDM world where I have to dumb everything down at the network edge to TDM and then send it back out as IP. I mean, I don't think that, well, I'm fine with that today, but in the future, if 251 does not apply to IP interconnections,
in the future if there's a problem.
Well, I mean, we're working on two simultaneous paths. We're getting the technical specs ready, as you say, we're really early in how we physically interconnect. But at the same time, right now at the FCC, the discussion lies on the legal landscape. So once we work out the technical specs, we then need to be ready with the legal landscape to understand where we stand.
And I think we're going to have a great opportunity for that with the upcoming keynote. Hopefully there'll be some comment on this transition aspect relative to interconnection. This has been a great panel. We do have to move on. It's noon here. We're going to have lunch. I'll let Danielle explain that, but I do want to thank our panelists for the bravery today and working with each other. I know you guys see each other outside of here, and it's wonderful to see this robust debate exhibited so nicely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.